Okay, so the functional groups just keep on a coming. Oh, when will they ever stop? And the answer is they probably never will. All right, so the next functional group we said that we're going to talk about is something called a nitrile functional group. And a nitrile functional group is a carbon that is triple bonded, but it's to a nitrogen, not to a carbon. So I'm not really going to see the big dominant triple bond peak that's to the left of 3000. That is not what I'm looking for here. So this is no peak to the left of 3000. A lot of people get that confused. But the 3000 and to the left of it, this is really only for a carbon that's triple bonded to another carbon. That is why that is there, and that's why we talked about that first. This one is different because it's a carbon that's attached to a nitrogen and not to another carbon. So in this infrared spectrum, I'm going to see a different type of signal. It's going to be in a different location. Okay, so what do I really see with the nitrile groups? Also keep in mind that nitrile, some people also call this cyano. CYANO, the cyano group. Either one of these are okay. It just really depends on when you were born. Some of the older chemists still refer to this as the cyano group, and some of the younger chemists will begin to refer this to the nitrile group. All right, so where do I really see this happen? All right, for the cyano group, over here on the infrared spectrum, you're going to see an area that's going to be very dominant, just like the alkene was. But this peak is going to happen around 2200, give or take a little bit. All right, so 2200. Now, again, there's room for wiggle in here. It can go backward, it can go forward. But 2200 is typically somewhere in the middle or the first 1/3 of the infrared spectrum. And the shape of this peak is something very similar that you've already seen. It comes down and then it comes straight back up and then it goes back to baseline. So these are very what we call sharp peaks, which means they're very narrow. Okay, so they're very sharp and they're very intense, meaning that they go down very far on the spectrum itself. So 2200, give or take. Some people will say 2260, but that's really up to you. 2200 or 2260 is where you would need to look for a nitrile functional group. Okay, so let's take a look at some nitrile functional groups and their spectra to see how easy these things are to pick out. So here's one. This is propion nitrile, and here I see a dip. It's a double dip here in the very beginning. And this is the symbolic presence of nitrogen. Remember, we've already talked about amides and amines. And because the amide and the amine is NH2 or a C double bond NH2, we saw a little dip. It was a double dip here in the very beginning when those happened. And this was the presence of the nitrogen containing group. Well, look at this. We have nitrogen here as well. So very often you will see that dip here in the very front part of the infrared spectrum. I'm going to say often because it doesn't happen every single time, but it's a very good indicator that you do have a nitrogen containing group, and that's what we see here in the very beginning. But more than that, what really sets us apart, and it's very unique in a way to nitrile, is this 2200 peak that's right here. This is almost like a carbonyl peak, right? The carbonyl peaks were very strong. A lot of times they were very narrow, like this one. And that's what we're seeing here, but it's at 2200, not at 1700. So that is the presence of my nitrile group, my C triple bond N. This gives me a little bit better feeling that it's a nitrile because I do see the double dip for the nitrogen containing group. All right, now the reason that I say often, right? I put often, not every single time, is that here we have another nitrile group, C triple bond N, down here at the very bottom. This is 4-methyl pentane nitrile. And then on the infrared spectrum, I do not really see that NH2 group double dip in the very beginning. So if you look at that area, you might see a little double bump, but it's so insignificant that I will probably miss it as I begin to look for it. So that, it might be present, it's just not very dominant. So I need to look for other things for the nitrile. And just like I said before, look at the 2200 peak. That's all that you need to go by to identify a nitrile containing group. And here at 2200, I'm going to come up and I see that little jagged peak right there, and that is the presence of the nitrile group. Now, this one's a little strange because it seems a little shorter. It's not as intense, but it's very narrow and it's very sharp. But its presence is there. So this is a nitrile containing compound. Here's another one, valeronitrile. And valeronitrile again has a C triple bond N. Notice here on the infrared spectrum, up here to the left, I do see the double dip for the nitrogen containing group like amine or amide, but I told you don't look at that one for nitrile. Nitrile will always show up at 2200, and right here it is. So at 2200, I come up, and there is the big dominant peak at 2200. So that is the presence of a nitrile group. All right. So, in the next video, what we will talk about, since we're talking about nitrogens, is the nitro group, and that's the NO2 group. All right. So, for the nitrile, you only have to look at 2200. And at 2200, if you see a peak that is there, then that's probably a positive sign that your compound has a C triple bond N molecule. One of the most common molecules that you'll use in a laboratory is something called acetonitrile. And acetonitrile is a carbon with a triple bond N. Acet is the often root word for two carbons. And this is used as mobile phase in the HPLC world. So if you're taking the instrumentation class, or maybe you've already completed it, maybe you know a little bit about HPLC already, acetonitrile is a very common compound that is used in that instrumentation. So that's something that you'll see over and over and over when it comes to mobile phases. So in the next video, we'll talk about nitro groups, and we'll pick it up from there.